Las Vegas, 1972.
The lights dimmed, and the orchestra fell silent. Then Elvis did something no one expected. He walked to the piano, dismissed the band, and said, "This one's for her." Nobody knew who her was, until Anne Margaret stood up in the front row, hands shaking, eyes shining. The next 3 minutes would turn an entire crowd speechless. July 1972, the International Hotel in Las Vegas was a cathedral of sound. Inside, rehearsals rumbled like thunder. Cables snaked across the floor, guitars leaned against velvet chairs, and the air was dense with cigarette smoke and anticipation. Elvis Presley had been pacing for hours. He was dressed in black slacks and a loose white shirt, his hair tousled from running his hands through it too many times. Every few minutes he scribbled something in a battered notebook on the piano lid. The band thought he was rewriting old numbers for the set list. He wasn't. He was writing something no one else was supposed to see. James Burton, his guitarist, leaned toward Jerry Sheff, the bassist. "Boss ain't been himself all day," he whispered, "like he's waitin' on a ghost." They weren't wrong. Across town, Anne Margaret was filming The Train Robbers and had sent word she'd be at opening night. For Elvis, that changed everything. They had shared a connection years earlier while filming Viva Las Vegas. A connection so intense it blurred the line between fiction and truth. They loved each other deeply, but life and expectations pulled them apart. Now she was coming to see him again, and Elvis could feel the weight of every unsaid word pressing on his chest. He sat at the piano, fingers hovering over the keys. The melody he'd been working on for 3 nights drifted into the room like smoke. Soft, lonely, almost a whisper. Burton paused, tuning his guitar. "What's that?" Elvis didn't answer. He kept playing the same haunting phrase, over and over, eyes half closed. He murmured a line under his breath. "You're the dream I still wake up to." The band fell silent. It wasn't a rehearsal anymore. It was a confession set to music. Colonel Tom Parker walked in, chewing a cigar. "Elvis, the press is waiting downstairs," he barked. "What is this stuff? Stick to the hits." Elvis didn't look up. "Just workin' through something." Parker huffed. "Then work fast." He left, slamming the door. Elvis kept playing. Each note was a memory. Her laugh echoing on set, her hand in his as they hid from photographers, her voice saying goodbye that final night in Memphis. He pressed harder on the keys until the sound cracked. The microphone buzzed from feedback. He winced, then laughed quietly to himself. Even the piano's trying to forget. That line stuck, he jotted it down. Outside the door, Joe Esposito peeked in. "Elvis, you comin' to dinner?" "In a minute," Elvis said. He kept his eyes on the page. At the top he wrote, "For her." Hours later, when the band finally left, he remained alone beneath the harsh rehearsal lights. His voice filled the empty room with a tender gravity no audience had ever heard. Outside, the Las Vegas sky glowed electric blue. Inside, Elvis Presley was writing the most personal song of his life. A song he might never record, but one he needed to sing once for someone who would understand. He closed his notebook, tapped the cover twice, and whispered, "Tomorrow night." The next evening would mark the first time Elvis ever walked onto a stage with a secret in his set list. The band thought they were preparing for a concert. They weren't. They were preparing for a confession. Because when the lights rose on August 2nd, 1972, the king would not just perform, he would bleed through a microphone. What was in that song that Elvis couldn't say out loud? Have you ever wished for one last chance to say what you never could? August 2nd, 1972, Las Vegas International Hotel. The crowd of 22,000 swelled like an ocean behind red velvet curtains. Reporters lined the aisles, pens ready, flashbulbs crackling against the stage. Elvis stood in the wings, quiet. He'd worn the new white jumpsuit stitched with gold lightning bolts, a design meant to project confidence. But his hands betrayed him. They trembled slightly as he adjusted his collar. Joe Esposito leaned in, sensing something different. "You good, E?" Elvis smiled thinly. "I'm fine, Joe. Just feels like the air's heavier tonight." Behind the curtain, the orchestra tuned. The sound was chaos, horns blaring, cymbals clashing. But all Elvis could hear was the pounding in his chest. He took a deep breath, whispered a prayer, and walked into the light. The room erupted. 22,000 voices screamed his name, the roar shaking the chandeliers. He grinned, waved, and launched into CC Rider. The brass hit like thunder. The crowd was his again, or so it seemed. But even as he moved across the stage, hips snapping with the old swagger, his eyes kept sweeping the front rows. He wasn't looking for approval. He was looking for her. Then he saw it, flashes of red hair catching the light. Anne Margaret, sitting near the stage, a white dress glowing against the dark velvet seats. For a moment, the noise of the audience vanished. His next lyric faltered, only for half a second, but the band noticed. James Burton's fingers hesitated on the strings. Colonel Parker frowned from the wings. Elvis covered the slip with a grin, spinning his mic, pretending it was all part of the act. The audience never suspected, but the musicians knew. Something had cracked beneath that smile. He drove through the next few numbers. Burning Love, Hound Dog, Suspicious Minds, each one faster, louder, a little more desperate. Sweat poured down his temples. Between verses he caught glimpses of her face. She wasn't clapping wildly like the others. She was watching quietly, almost tenderly, as if she could see the battle behind the sparkle. Mid-set, Burton leaned toward the drummer. He's pushing too hard.
Ronnie Toot nodded.
Something's coming. Elvis ended Suspicious Minds with a flourish, microphone twirling above his head. The crowd exploded, but he didn't take a bow. He turned his back, shoulders rising and falling, catching his breath. He felt the moment closing in, the one he dreaded and craved all day. The piano waited in the corner like a secret burning a hole in his heart. Colonel Parker shuffled nervously by the curtains, muttering to an assistant, "Don't let him go off set. Stick to the list." But Elvis wasn't listening. He'd already made up his mind. He turned toward the band. "Take 5, he said. His voice carried through the mic, clear but rough. The musicians exchanged looks. This wasn't in the plan. The audience quieted, sensing something unusual. Elvis moved slowly across the stage, every step deliberate. He reached the piano, brushed the dust from its lid, and sat down. The lights dimmed until only a single spotlight framed him in gold. He leaned toward the microphone. "You know," he said softly, "some songs come from the radio, and some come from the heart." A ripple ran through the crowd. He looked straight ahead, past the front row, past the blinding lights, to where she sat. The same eyes that once met his across movie sets, across stolen nights. For the first time in years, the distance between them felt unbearable. He took a deep breath. His fingers rested on the keys. "This one," he murmured, "is for her." The orchestra froze. Colonel Parker's face went pale. James Burton whispered, "What's he doing?" Elvis didn't answer. He struck the first chord, soft, trembling, full of everything he'd never said. The crowd hushed instantly. Even the waiters stopped mid-stride. And Margaret's eyes widened. She knew. What happened next made even the colonel step out from the wings in shock. Because Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was about to break every rule he'd ever been given for love. Can a single song become a confession? What truth would you risk the world hearing just once? The stage was quiet now. The roar of 22,000 people had fallen to a single breath. The spotlights narrowed, painting Elvis alone at the piano, white suit gleaming like porcelain under the heat. A thin wisp of smoke curled up from a fan's cigarette in the dark, drifting through the beam. Elvis pressed one key. A low A. It hung in the air like a heartbeat. Then another, and another. No one recognized the tune. He looked down, took a deep breath, and began to sing. "You're the dream I still wake up to." The first line was almost a whisper, but the microphone carried it like prayer. A woman in the balcony gasped. Couples reached for each other's hands without knowing why. On stage, James Burton froze mid-stride. He'd never heard this song. Neither had the orchestra. And Margaret had. The moment those words touched the air, she covered her mouth. Her eyes filled. Every verse peeled back a piece of the story only they knew. The laughter on movie sets, the nights they snuck out past reporters, the final drive down Sunset when neither could say goodbye. Elvis's voice cracked. He didn't hide it. He leaned into the imperfection, letting it bleed into the melody. I let you go so you could fly. The line trembled. He closed his eyes. Behind the curtain, Colonel Parker whispered to a stagehand, "Cut the lights after this. He's off script." No one moved. The hotel's massive room, usually filled with clinking glasses and camera flashes, felt like church. Elvis's fingers drifted across the keys, slow and deliberate, as if each note carried a memory. He saw her again in his mind. Anne Margaret on the Viva Las Vegas set, hair catching sunlight, laughter spilling like music. Back then, she'd called him EP, and said his eyes gave away every secret. He'd loved her for that honesty, and feared it, too. Now, 10 years later, the truth was finally spilling out, dressed as melody. At the third verse he whispered, "If I had one more day to hold you." He stopped. His throat closed. Silence. For a moment, it felt like the world paused. Then he played on. The crowd listened so quietly that you could hear the creak of the piano pedal. Somewhere in the back, a woman sobbed softly. Anne Margaret's tears glimmered under the lights. She wasn't hiding them. Elvis looked up just long enough to meet her eyes. That single glance carried everything: love, regret, gratitude, surrender. He returned to the keys. Some songs you only get to sing once. He let the final chord ring until it dissolved into silence. Then nothing.
No applause.
No movement. Only stillness. A glass clinked somewhere, echoing like thunder. Elvis exhaled. For a split second he looked younger, relieved, lighter, like the weight of an entire decade had just lifted off his shoulders. Colonel Parker stepped forward, trying to restore control. "Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Elvis Press." Elvis held up a hand. He wasn't finished. He turned back to the mic, voice raw. "Some folks think a stage is for showing off. But sometimes, it's the only place you can tell the truth." The audience erupted. Not with wild cheers, but with applause that felt human, heartfelt, sacred. People stood slowly, realizing they just witnessed something no one would ever hear again. Anne Margaret rose from her seat, tears running freely. She mouthed two words that only he could read. "Thank you." Elvis smiled faintly, pressed his palms together in a quiet prayer, and stepped away from the piano. The band still hadn't moved. Burton whispered, "What do we play now?" No one answered. The house lights flickered. Fans craned their necks, waiting for another hit, another joke, another move. But Elvis had given them something rarer: vulnerability. As he walked off stage, the echo of that last chord trailed behind him like a ghost. The curtain fell. The crowd sat motionless, unsure whether to applaud or simply sit in silence. Behind the curtain, Colonel Parker's voice hissed, "You'll never do that again on my stage." Elvis didn't reply. He just said, "Yes, Colonel." But the small smile on his face said otherwise. That night, for the first and only time, the king had broken his own crown and shown the man beneath it. When he reached the dressing room door, he stopped and looked back toward the muffled hum of the audience. Somewhere out there, she was still standing. He whispered under his breath, "That was for you." The door closed behind him. When Elvis reached the final line, Anne Margaret's reaction broke the entire room's heart. What would you do if your greatest secret was suddenly sung to the world? The curtain had barely closed when the crowd began to stir. It wasn't the usual roar that followed an Elvis Presley finale. It was quieter, an uneasy mix of awe, confusion, and something close to reverence. Moments ago, they had seen the king of rock and roll stripped of all armor, sitting alone at a piano, singing a song no one had ever heard. The room still trembled from it. Even the chandeliers seemed to sway slower. Then, as if on cue, the curtain lifted again. Elvis stepped back into the light. His face glistened with sweat, his hair damp against his forehead. He looked out into the sea of faces and saw what he had been searching for all night. Front row, left center, Anne-Margret. Her eyes were red. Her hands pressed against her mouth. Tears rolled down her cheeks, glinting in the light. Elvis didn't speak. He simply nodded. The crowd, still half in disbelief, erupted into applause, but not the usual scream-filled chaos. It was slower, heavier, full of emotion. A standing ovation built like a wave until the entire hall was on its feet. Elvis smiled faintly, shook his head, and raised a hand. The applause faded. He leaned into the microphone. "Some songs," he said softly. "You only get to sing once." The audience went silent again. The orchestra conductor glanced toward Colonel Parker for direction, but the colonel just stared, motionless. Even he knew this wasn't a show anymore. Elvis looked toward the piano, then back at Anne-Margret. His voice broke slightly. "That was one of 'em." A woman in the third row began crying. The man beside her placed his arm around her shoulders. Something in that room had changed, the kind of change that happens when truth breaks through the glitter. For 30 seconds, no one moved. You could hear the faint hum of the ceiling fans and the click of a single camera shutter. Anne-Margret stood. She didn't care that the spotlight followed her now. She just looked at him, eyes trembling with gratitude and grief. Then she mouthed 2 words, "Thank you." Elvis lowered his head, smiled faintly, and whispered into the microphone, "You're welcome, darlin'." The crowd gasped. Some recognized the name from the old rumors, the tabloids that once whispered about them years ago. But seeing it play out in real time, here on this stage, felt like witnessing the ending of a love story too real to belong to celebrities. He turned to the band. "Let's take it home," he said, but his voice wavered. The band began the intro to "Can't Help Falling in Love." The strings swelled, soft and patient. Elvis sang it slower than usual, every syllable drenched in sincerity. He didn't look at the crowd. He sang only to her. "Take my hand, take my whole life too." Anne-Margret closed her eyes. The tears kept falling, but she didn't wipe them away. She wanted to feel every second of it. The orchestra softened. Elvis stood, bowed slightly toward her, and left the microphone on the piano. The music continued without him. Just strings and piano and a silence that carried weight. Then, before the final chord, he walked off stage. The crowd froze. Nobody clapped. Nobody moved. They simply watched as the king disappeared into the darkness behind the curtain. Anne-Margret sat down, covering her face. Her shoulders shook as she cried. Around her, people began clapping again. Quiet at first, then thunderous. It wasn't for the performance anymore. It was for the moment. Even the waitstaff stopped what they were doing. Some were crying too. The air in the International Hotel that night felt different, heavier, as if love itself had been let loose in the room. Backstage, technicians stared at each other, unsure if they should follow him. Colonel Parker rubbed his temples, muttering, "He's never done that before, and he never would again." What the audience didn't know was that this wasn't an act or a stunt or nostalgia. It was a goodbye that had taken 10 years to find a voice. Have you ever watched 2 people say farewell without speaking a single word? Because in that Vegas showroom on August 2nd, 1972, time itself seemed to stop just long enough for Elvis Presley and Anne-Margret to finally finish their conversation, the one they started years earlier in the glow of movie lights. When the curtain fell for the last time that night, the king didn't just end a show. He closed a chapter of his heart. And the crowd, 22,000 strong, knew they'd just witnessed something that would never happen again. Backstage was a blur of sound. Clapping from the hall, muffled voices through the concrete walls, the squeal of feedback still humming in the cables. Elvis stood alone near his dressing room door, sweat darkening the collar of his jumpsuit. His reflection in the mirror didn't look like the man on the posters outside. It looked like someone who had just told the truth. He poured a glass of water, but his hand shook. The glass rattled against the counter. A single drop of blood trickled from his fingertip where he'd pressed the piano keys too hard. He didn't even notice. The door creaked open. She was there. Anne-Margret stepped quietly into the room, a shawl around her shoulders, eyes still wet. The The bodyguards stepped back without being told. For the first time in years, there were no photographers, no scripts, no studio lights, just two people suspended in silence. Elvis smiled faintly. Guess I finally said it. Her lips trembled into a small laugh. You always did. You just needed a piano to say it out loud. He looked down, shaking his head. You were the one thing I never finished. Anne-Margaret took his hand, the same hand that had trembled over those keys. You finished it tonight. They sat on the couch, the noise of the crowd fading into a distant pulse. For a moment, it felt like the early days again. Two young stars who believed the spotlight could last forever. He reached behind the mirror, pulled out a folded sheet of paper, edges creased and smudged with pencil marks. This is yours, he said. It was always yours. She unfolded it slowly. At the top, in his handwriting, were 4 words. For her, forever, EP. Anne-Margaret ran her fingers across the lyrics, tears falling onto the paper. You know they'll never understand this, she whispered. They don't have to, he said. It was never for them. For a long minute, neither spoke. Only the faint hum of the hotel air vents filled the room. Outside, fans still shouted his name, but he didn't move toward the door. Then, from somewhere down the hall, the band began to pack up. A piano chord echoed one sharp, lonely note. Elvis stood. Dance with me, he said quietly. And Margaret hesitated. Here? Why not here? He replied, smiling for the first time that night. It's the only stage that's real. He hummed the melody from the song, and they swayed slowly across the carpeted floor. No orchestra, no cameras, just memory. He held her close, whispering, Do you ever think about what could have been? All the time, she answered. But maybe it was supposed to be this way. You write songs. I remember them. He chuckled softly. That's fair. When the song in his head ended, they stood still for a moment longer, arms around each other, eyes closed. Then he stepped back, nodded once, and said, Time to let it go. Anne-Margaret folded the lyric sheet carefully, pressing it to her heart. I'll keep it safe. You already have, he said. At the door, she turned one last time. Will you ever record it? Elvis looked at the piano through the open doorway. No, he said. Some things are meant to be heard only once. She smiled sadly. Then thank you for letting me be that once. They both laughed through the ache, and then she was gone. Elvis sank back onto the couch, staring at the stage lights glowing faintly through the curtains. His voice dropped to a whisper. Goodbye, darling. Outside, a technician paused near the doorway and swore he heard a faint melody drifting from the empty stage. The same tune Elvis had played hours before. After that night, neither of them ever spoke publicly about the song. Reporters asked, fans guessed, but both stayed silent. Because closure doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it's a melody, played once in a lifetime, and then let go. Is closure ever really final? Or does it live quietly inside the songs we leave behind? That night, the king of rock and roll didn't just perform. He found peace. 10 years after that night in Vegas, the song no one had heard should have been lost forever. But fate had other plans. 1983 RCA Studios, Nashville. In a basement full of old tape reels and dusty boxes, a young audio engineer named Mark Henderson was cataloging recordings for the label's archive. Most were routine session takes, tuning, banter, false starts. Then he found a reel marked in fading blue ink, Vegas 72, untitled. He threaded it onto the player. The machine clicked and whirred. A moment of static, then a low hum of a crowd fading into silence. And then the piano. The first notes were soft, hesitant, but impossible to mistake. Mark froze. The voice that followed did something no audio engineer expected. It made him cry. You're the dream I still wake up to. It was Elvis. Not studio Elvis, not the polished soundtrack voice. This was different, bare, unshielded, human. Mark called his supervisor downstairs. Within minutes, a half-dozen employees stood in that tiny room, listening as history played through a cheap speaker. Some were speechless. Others had tears in their eyes. When the final line came, Some songs you only get to sing once. No one spoke. They knew they'd found something sacred. RCA logged it as a private performance from the International Hotel, August 2nd, 1972. The Colonel had ordered every show recorded for security. But this tape had never been released, perhaps out of respect, perhaps because it was too personal. News of the discovery spread quietly through music circles. Bootleg copies appeared within months, circulating on cassette under the title The Secret Song. Collectors whispered about it like a myth. Some called it Elvis's last love letter. The public didn't know who the song was for, not until a reporter asked Anne-Margrethe about it in 1997. She paused for a long moment, then smiled gently. "It was the kindest goodbye I ever received," she said. Nothing more. That single sentence was enough. Fans connected the dots. The song that had brought a Vegas crowd to tears was about her. Radio stations started playing the bootleg. People pulled over their cars to listen in silence. Letters poured into RCA from listeners who said the song made them call someone they had lost. One note read, "He taught me that love isn't over just because it ends." Anne-Margrethe never claimed ownership. She kept her promise of silence. But a friend later revealed that she still had the original sheet music framed in her living room, the paper yellowed and soft from age. At the bottom, Elvis's signature was barely visible, smudged from where her tears had once fallen. In Graceland, fans still leave flowers near a small plaque installed in the museum's west wing. It reads, "Some songs you only get to sing once." Beneath the engraving is a replica of the lyric sheet, edges torn but words intact. Visitors stand in front of it quietly, often crying without knowing why. Because the truth behind that song is something every person understands. We've all had someone we never properly said goodbye to. A plaque worker at Graceland once said, "It's the only display people don't take selfies with. They just stand there and listen to the recording that plays on a loop, as if Elvis is still trying to finish the sentence he never got to say." Every year, on the anniversary of his death, fans gather outside the gates and play that bootleg tape. When the last line comes, they sing it together under the Tennessee moon. Some songs you only get to sing once. The sound rises into the night like a promise kept across time. How many goodbyes are hidden inside the music we love? Decades later, people still talk about that night in Las Vegas. Not as a concert, as a moment. For most, Elvis Presley will always be the man who changed music. The hips, the lightning, the voice that shook the world. But for those who know the story of the secret song, he became something far greater. Proof that vulnerability could be just as powerful as fame. Historians describe that 1972 show as the most human performance of his career. There was no glitter in that moment, no choreography, no showmanship. Only truth. Anne-Margrethe once said in a private interview, "That song was the real Elvis, the man behind the crown." She still keeps the lyric sheet, framed under glass. The ink has faded to gray. But if you look closely, one fingerprint remains pressed into the paper, his. When visitors ask why she keeps it after all these years, she always gives the same answer. Because he meant every word. That simple statement tells you everything about the king's quietest gift. He didn't build it with guitars or gold records. He built it with honesty. In the years since, fans have created online communities dedicated to the secret song. Every August, on the anniversary of that Vegas show, people around the world post the lyrics' final line. Some songs you only get to sing once. And for a few hours, strangers connected by love and nostalgia flood timelines with messages not about Elvis's fame, but about the people they once loved, the things they never said, and the goodbyes that still echo. Because somehow that's what he left them with. Not just music, but permission, to feel deeply, to remember, to forgive. Even younger generations who never saw him live understand it. A teenager who discovered the bootleg on YouTube once commented, "It feels like he's talking to someone I lost too." Thousands replied, saying they felt the same. That's the kind of legacy that doesn't age. It doesn't fade with headlines or decades. It moves quietly, from heart to heart, like a melody too sacred to forget. In the quiet corner of Graceland, the plaque still stands. Tour guides don't say much about it. They just point and the visitors linger. Some whisper, some cry, some simply close their eyes as the playback loop fills the room. You can still hear the soft crackle of the recording. Elvis's voice breaking slightly, piano echoing in the background. A man laying down a truth disguised as a song. A museum worker once said, "Every day, someone comes out of that room different than when they went in. That's the magic of honesty." Elvis Presley left the world with stadiums full of noise, but it was his quietest moment that outlived them all. And somewhere in California, Anne Margaret still listens to that tape once a year on his birthday. She doesn't play it loud, just loud enough to hear the faint hum before the first line. When it ends, she whispers the same words she said that night in Vegas. "Thank you." Because the truth is, love never really leaves. It just finds new verses. Elvis's voice made history, but his silence made meaning. He proved that even a king can still be human, and that the right song, sung once, can last forever. Elvis didn't just write a love song. He left a lesson, that honesty outlives applause. If the story touched you, share it with someone who once said goodbye too soon. Because some songs are never truly over. They just keep playing quietly in the hearts that still remember. And that is the real sound of forever.